Variance funding.
Hi, Brian.
If you guys, anybody that's currently taking the multi-discharge funding from for this discharge, you've probably seen a lot of checks come in your mail from wastewater treatment plants lately, and they're varied amounts of what you might expect or what you get, but all of a sudden you're getting these checks that you now have the ability to spend. So this session is going to be talking about two ways of, one is from the DNR's perspective of how that's working. I'm hoping to see what they see going down the road, and that will be Matt Claucherty and Andrew Craig. And the second session will be with the county's perspective, and that will be given a presentation or talk from Paul Tollard from Fond du Lac County. So with that, if you got any questions, you can just put them in the chat and we will ask questions most likely at the end unless there's something really important in between. So with that, take it away, Matt and Andrew.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending bright and early. Yeah, happy to have everyone's ear for 20-30 minutes here and go over what the state's seeing is for the multi-discharge variance and get some thoughts from Paul as well. So Andrew Craig and I coordinate the multi-discharge variance program at DNR, and I'd say Andrew's focus in his role in the runoff management division is focusing on non-point implementation of the variance, and then my role in the wastewater program is to interface with the point source dischargers that are involved in the variance. So we kind of team up with our respective specialties to make this work for y'all. So we will go into what we're supposed to cover today, and I'll provide a brief MDV 101, just cover the basics to make sure everyone's familiar with what the program entails if we've got some new folks in the audience. And I'll go back over the last 5 years of MDV implementation. Now that we are, you know, kind of well down the road, maybe we don't even call this program new anymore. We'll look at the geographic breakdown of funding that's been made available to counties through this program, and some of the environmental outcomes that have been achieved now that we do have some reporting data to share. We'll provide an update on our BMP implementation tracking system, as many of you have interfaced with that and are always eager for improvements and the latest and greatest there. And then we'll make some predictions. We'll look at the crystal ball for the future of MDV funding and just what that looks like on a statewide basis going forward into the next 5 years here. So I think with that, we'll dive in, unless Andrew, you have any opening comments or thoughts.
Well, just that Matt and I are going to be taking turns on different slides, so it'll be the Matt and Andrew show here today, and then we'll get to Paul's comments later and opportunity to share his experiences, and then at the end we can take questions, or we might be able to field a few questions in between.
Yeah, I know if you add questions to the chat, they'll come through. I think Brian's going to read those for us. So. All right. So MDV, sometimes folks get this acronym confused with the DMV, which brings up all sorts of emotions. But that acronym stands for the multi-discharger variance, and that isn't necessarily intuitive as far as the name for a program goes. So I'll kind of describe how this works. It all started back in 2010. Many of you may remember this, that the state adopted numeric phosphorus standards for surface waters. It is a leap forward as far as reducing nutrient pollution in our waters of the state to have those numeric standards. Most states do not have these. This is like the the Cadillac of nutrient regulation, at least for point source discharges. So it created some pretty hefty requirements for our wastewater plants, both our municipal publicly owned treatment works and industrial dischargers, the food processors, the cheese factories, et cetera, to comply with really low phosphorus effluent limits that are in their discharge permits now. And when you look at what those limits entail, as far as meeting that limit at the end of the pipe, it's typically filtering effluent, which is above and beyond most wastewater treatment currently in place in the state, and typically very expensive. A couple $1 million for a small village even to invest in this equipment. So when we look at economic impacts of new regulations, this one stands out as an impactful regulation. We're talking about sewer user rates doubling in a lot of communities, industries potentially moving elsewhere because they have such high costs to comply here. So to help ease that burden, the state has adopted alternative compliance strategies for these phosphorus limits. You may have heard of water quality trading or adaptive management. And if those aren't doable for a discharger, then we can look at variances as another option. The statewide variance, our multi-discharger variance, basically packages a bunch of variances into one EPA approval and allows us to use a system that capitalizes on economy of scale. The system that is most relevant here today is our county payment system that's part of the variance. So those dischargers that are covered pay $50 per pound of phosphorus discharged, and they don't need to make that major facility upgrade when they're doing that. Counties then use the funding that's paid to implement agricultural practices that reduce phosphorus loading to surface waters. So the idea is that this money can be better spent than spending millions to filter effluent. We can spend less money and get more phosphorus reductions from the landscape. The state used our NR 151 regs to help support this, and it was approved back in 2017. We've seen the program grow since 2017. This has been, I don't want to say the default for dischargers, but when no other options exist, this MDV route with the county payment option is usually there for them if needed. So that has definitely eased our permitting process. We've seen now over 100 dischargers covered in this program, and you can see in the table there the associated numbers and county payment totals continuing to grow, though somewhat plateauing as we move forward. Keep adding more facilities. We've been hovering around that $1 million mark now for a few years, and I'll talk more about what facilities are doing to reduce their phosphorus effluent, but many have done enough at the plant to keep those payments pretty low. So we see average payment value in 2022 of $10,000. Generally a pretty good deal when you look at the alternatives for those facilities. And we did see slightly fewer counties participate this year, as you might note on the table there. So I'll turn it over to Andrew to talk about where the funding's going.
Great, thanks, Matt. So showing where we were or have been is the image on the left, or the map on the left. The darker the colors the different colored images represent Huck 8 size watersheds. So pretty large watersheds. And within those watersheds, there are wastewater plants or industrial plants that have signed up for the MDV and are making payments available for counties to sign up for. The darker the color, the more funding that's been provided by one or more dischargers. And the image on the left is the distribution and density of, or amount of funding available in 2019. The image on the right shows what's going on a couple years later in 2021. The pattern we've seen is that there was more participation by dischargers in the west side of the state a couple years ago, and now we're seeing a west to east progression where additional dischargers are now signing up for it in the central and the eastern part of the state. And this map reflects that increase and that shift in geography. As the slide says here, MDV is more widely available than ever, and the slide Matt showed earlier showed the total amount of dischargers and the amount of dischargers that have signed up for it. Matt, if I recall correctly, we're estimating we might have about 140 dischargers signed up in the next year or so. Was that their expectation?
Yeah, thereabouts.
Okay. So that's kind of gives you kind of a pattern of what's been going on and where, and gives you an idea, at least in the next year, which we have more confidence predicting 1 year ahead versus 2 or 3 years ahead, because this is strictly a decision by point source dischargers to elect to use the multi-discharge variance. Other facilities that Matt described have also signed up for other options like trading or adaptive management too. Next slide. So another thing we want to share with you today is the BMP implementation tracking system, BITS. Many of you who have signed up, if you're a county that's signed up for MDV, have been asked to use this system, and it has evolved and improved over time. And the first bullet I think I want to spend the most time on, we can't improve a system. The system's not been perfect, it never has been. And we're committed to making it more user-friendly, and by the only way you can do that is getting feedback. And you guys have been very patient, the counties that have signed up and have emailed us questions or called staff or others, giving us time to work through some of the bugs and the problems that BITS have had. Over time, we've dedicated more staff time. Molly Richardson, many of you have spoken to her, I think, and she's listening in today, has been an example of how we're committing more resources to making this a better, more efficient, and easier to use tool. And it can be used for a lot of different reasons, not just for counties to use it, but there could be other users that we have in mind. And one of those users are wastewater plants and dischargers that have signed up. We've recently improved transparency for those users. The wastewater plants and others dischargers can request and receive read-only access. So they can go in and look at what's inside BITS, but they can't change anything. And that's a pretty powerful tool. It takes kind of the mystery away of who's doing what or how, and it allows people to readily access the system, which I think is a really important part of BITS that we want to continue that strategy going forward. Another feature we're working on for BITS is automated annual reports. One of the requirements of MDV is that counties send reports to dischargers and DACCAP and others about what happened, how much money did you use, how much phosphorus was reduced. We're trying to figure out, or we are working on creating annual reports that will summarize that information by county, by watershed, and so on, to simplify the process. So to make that easier for those of you that sign up for BITS, if you're a county, to make that process easier. Matt, I'll hand the baton back to you.
All right. So we'll transition to talk about what the program has accomplished as far as on-the-ground pollution reductions. DNR recently completed our 5-year review of the program that's required by federal regs for any variance. And what we found is that there's a number of improvements that are being made to our surface waters, and those come from two sources. One from the non-point reductions that you all are working on, and I think Andrew will talk more about in a minute, and then also phosphorus effluent reductions based on those those facilities that are cleaning up their effluent. So what we've found is that the county payments really drive optimization at wastewater plants. Those plants have now a financial incentive to do what they can to reduce phosphorus in their discharge. It's typically not enough to meet their final limit. The premise of the variance is that that wouldn't be affordable, but they can really reduce those numbers substantially. So we've seen facilities install phosphorus treatment, chemical or biological treatment, and based on all of the upgrades that have occurred and all of the wastewater that's discharged, we've seen about 127,000 pounds per year less phosphorus loading to the surface waters of the state from this. So that's somewhat to be expected early in the process here as we're getting more dischargers on board with this program and meeting their required interim limits.
All right, back to me. That prior slide, I just want to point out that report that Matt had shown there. I believe that's available on our webpage, Matt, if people want to look at that.
Yep, and I believe it was shared with
right.
County participants as well.
Great. So there's a lot of details in there. Just wanted to reference that there's an opportunity to go back and look at that for those of you that want to dive into the details. I want to share some of the program accomplishments with you. On the right, it shows a table of different counties that have signed up for MDV and the typical or most common practices they've selected to reduce phosphorus. They run the gamut of both cropland and structural practices on feedlots or other manure storage structures, things like that. Pretty typical to some of the existing conservation programs counties are implementing for meeting their land water plan requirements or other initiatives. In what we've tried to share with these metrics is an annual reduction. And in the 2021 reports that we received from counties, which goes back to the year that funding was awarded, which was 2019. There's a lag time between when money is received and when counties who sign up for MDV have to report how they use those funds. 17,000 pounds per year reduction. You probably read the most common types. I've talked a little bit about that gamut of cropland annual based practices and then some structural practices that may last longer. And the implementation timeline has varied between counties with respect to implementing practices. And COVID-19 has been a barrier for that for some. And others, some counties have recently signed up and they're just starting to use funding or apply it in specific watersheds. And as you guys are all aware, sometimes it takes time to develop a relationship with different landowners to promote or adopt one or more of the practices you've seen here.
And I'll just note that you may not see your county's name on this screen unless you signed up early on in the MDV program. So yeah, this would be from 2019 funding and maybe some planning information from 2020 funding.
Correct. And that's another reason I mentioned that report at the start of this slide, that report that I described and Matt alluded to, that tells a more detailed story of which counties are doing what and the amounts and things like that too. We didn't want to take up all those slides here today. So another slide on program accomplishments, summarizing what's been accomplished over the last 5 years. We've done a dollar per pound metric program wide, and the magic number, it's approximately $30 per pound of phosphorus reduced. That's the amount from implementing cropland or feedlot structural based practices. And those are based on estimated reductions that counties have submitted within bits based on those practices adopted. This annual metric that we're talking about could be higher if we included other funding sources or matching from other programs in the total costs, or it could be lower if we counted future years of reductions achieved from the practices. We wanted to keep it simple, and we just look at basically the first or the second year of the practice and to do the math of the numerator and the denominator. If we get into longer term beyond that time frame, it can become very complicated, and some of you who are attending today can attest to that when we've talked about implementing TMDLs and tracking reductions accordingly.
So to talk a little bit about trends in funding that we're seeing, as we discussed already, we've got more facilities paying in across the state. So that means that there's more availability. Nowadays, I think nearly every Huck 8 watershed has funding available, where that wasn't the case in the first couple of years of the program. Facilities are improving effluent quality. They're on a per facility basis paying in less. And what this does result in is more stable levels of funding. So where we were at early in the program, we'd have a couple really big cash cow facilities that paid in like $100,000 to $200,000 a year, and that's great in those watersheds. But what we've also seen is those facilities can change their game, and that funding goes away really quick if the facility can do better with their phosphorus. So that results in some volatility moving forward. Now that we're kind of plateauing out with more stable funding levels, that I'm expecting less volatility in funding levels. When we approve a new TMDL, that can reduce the number of facilities that are covered under the MDV. TMDLs typically give some relief on phosphorus limits for point sources. So we've seen that somewhat in the Wisconsin River. We'll probably see that in the Upper Fox Wolf TMDL, as well as the Northeast Lakeshore TMDL that's under development.
Okay, so one of the earlier slides Matt provided kind of showed a table showing trends of county participation, and I'm going to follow up on that a little bit more here in this slide with you. The maximum number of counties so far that participated was in 2021, and that was 35 total counties. We're expecting that number to drop to 26 this year. And there's a couple different reasons we think that might be what's responsible for that decline. One of them is, and this is no stranger, the MDV funding can be used not only to implement practices, but a portion of it, up to 35%, can be used for staffing costs. That may not be enough to support the time and effort to use the MDV funding, and there's basically staff capacity is the limiting element here. And to really commit to this, having a dedicated position or a full person may be a good strategy for a county to follow. But to do that, you need to have the capacity within your county to do that, and MDV funding may not be enough to support that. And I think Paul might talk a little bit about this a little bit later. There are some restrictions to MDV funding. Some projects that have been proposed are in non-agricultural areas and for MDV funding. And if it's non-agriculture, there's a limit in the statute of MDV that the money has to be used to implement to reduce non-point source pollution, reduce phosphorus, and meet the statewide performance standards for agriculture. So when you get into non-agricultural areas, that sometimes that's a wall or a barrier that we have to accept because it's in statute. We can't diverge from that. Another thing that I think Paul will talk about a little bit too in his turn is unpredictable funding levels. That could be a challenge. We try our best to estimate at mid-year what we expect the amount of phosphorus that would be discharged by that wastewater plant, and then report that and share that with counties at the annual meetings that are often held to give you guys an idea or an estimation. Sometimes that will change based upon optimization at a wastewater plant, and that has happened with several dischargers. And the previous slide Matt talked about, I believe, showed about 117,000 pounds, Matt, somewhere in that range, has been achieved through optimization. And we're looking at about 17,000 pounds from the practices. So I don't think that's going to change. And that if wastewater plants continue to optimize, that's going to reduce how much phosphorus they discharge, and that will then reduce the funding available for MDV funding to counties. So how can you get a better idea of how that's all working? Pay attention or communicate with DNR about specific dischargers in the watersheds that you're considering or selecting. That's one way, and we can continue to have an ongoing conversation about that. We're not, it's an open door as far as we're concerned. We want to provide up-to-date information to counties so you guys can plan and be effective in using the MDV funding.
For a longer term look at MDV funding, we can provide the following. So for this next year, we have 140 facilities conditionally approved for coverage under the MDV. That's up from the 115 we had last year. So we're continuing to add facilities, and we expect this to continue for the next few years. Dischargers will likely use the MDV as much as they can. So I think we could have the program grow to about 200 facilities within a few more years here. I don't expect we'll have much higher funding levels. It generally plateaued at about $1 million. Maybe we'll work our way up to about $1.5 million across the state. But like I said, that funding is going to become more predictable because facilities are done optimizing. They do that early on, and then I think that non-point source reduction number will eventually surpass the point source reduction number as more time goes on here. The MDV is federally approved until 2027, so you can expect this money to be available through 2027. And then DNR is currently seeking reapproval. We permit 5 years ahead of time, so we're already looking at the end date of MDV in our permits. So we're seeking reapproval from EPA for a time period beyond 2027. The outcome of those conversations will certainly be made known to counties well before 2027. We'll know if we have another 10 years, for example, probably by next year or 2024 at the absolute latest. So that is it for DNR's segment. There's our typical Connect with Us slide, and that hyperlink color is just horrible on that blue background. From here, I think we'll transition to Paul.
Good morning, everybody. I'll kind of take you on the journey MDV journey that I've been kind of down since 2019. Fond du Lac County's been receiving multi-discharge variance funding since 2019 till present. So Fond du Lac County, and I'll kind of focus most of my conversations around the big MDV contributor for Fond du Lac County, which has been the city of Fond du Lac wastewater treatment plant. That's where the bulk of our MDV funding has come from. I do get it from a couple other basins, but I'll kind of focus more on my experiences with that. So Fond du Lac County is eligible for 53% of the MDV funding in the Lake Winnebago watershed. So whatever is coming from essentially the city of Fond du Lac's wastewater treatment plant, we're eligible for 53% of that. The other remaining 47% of the watershed is split almost evenly between Winnebago and Calumet counties. Preliminary estimates when we first started talking about MDV were in the neighborhood of around 186,000 is what we expected to get in 2019. Earlier estimates, I think, were even higher than that. I think they were even higher than $200,000. So when you look at that as over a 5-year period, which the MDV program was intended to be, that gets to be a lot of cost share dollars to try and get on the ground. That's a level of cost sharing like our department has not seen since the priority watershed days. And we had 4 priority watersheds going at one time, and staffing levels were really different than certainly what they are today because of that. But that's a lot of cost sharing to try and get back on the ground over a period of time. Multi-discharge variance, the plan is that it's going to continue to decline over a permit term. There, we talked about optimizations and efficiencies. That's the whole intent, but how much it's going to decline over time is kind of an unknown. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more about that. So I was having a lot of conversations with the city of Fond du Lac with regards to their permit and how they were going to meet their new permit limits. Prior to MDV, we were talking about adaptive management and trades and how our department could fit into that. And then MDV kind of became an option, and that's the one that they chose. So I was having a lot of conversations with them. I had not worked with the city of Fond du Lac wastewater treatment plant in my career very much at all. So we were basically just kind of getting to know each other and how we could kind of help each other out. And then MDV comes along. So we were working to implement that. There was a lot of questions about from the city. It's their money essentially that they're paying out. So there was a lot of questions about what the department was planning to do with it even before they cut the check. The east and west sides of Lake Winnebago also drain to the city of Fond du Lac. So those are called outside sewer districts. They're paying into the city of Fond du Lac, and the city of Fond du Lac is essentially cutting us a check through MDV. So they had questions about what we were going to do with MDV before we got the money. So I had a couple meetings where I was sitting down with outside sewer groups, and they wanted to know what we were planning to do. So those were some early conversations that I had before I even had the MDV money. And then we were doing or trying to do some watershed implementation since about 2014 in a small watershed on the east side of Lake Winnebago called the Pipe Creek Watershed. We were using several different funding sources to implement programming, and MDV kind of came along at a good time where we were kind of developing a short list of projects in that watershed that if we ever got the funding to do these, it would be great to be able to do them. MDV funding came along. It was originally intended to, MDV funding is originally intended to implement NR 151. The challenge that I have here in Fond du Lac with that is that we have a large participation of farmland preservation in our county, which means we have a large amount of compliance already through the farmland preservation program. So really where I wanted to start focusing the money in the Pipe Creek watershed, we already had a large portion of farmers meeting compliance because of that. So the other option that I was able to look at was implementation of a 9 key element plan with the MDV funding. So that's essentially before we even got the MDV money, we were hustling to try and get a 9 key element plan completed so that we could begin using the MDV money to implement that 9 key element plan. So that's kind of where our strategy kind of lied when we got the MDV money. So yeah, like I said, we've been trying to piece together funding. We completed that 9 key element plan just in time. So since we've received that initial funding, again, it was 186,000, which was what was estimated. By the time we got the funding, it was down to 115,000. So again, DNR is going to do their best to give you an estimate, but the estimate is just going to be that. You're really not going to know how much you're going to get until the checks start rolling in. So when you say, yes, I would like to accept MDV money, it's not long after that that the checks are essentially going to be starting to roll in. Some of those checks, in my case, why I got one really big one from the city of Fond du Lac, and the other basins, you're going to get a check from distant wastewater treatment plant in that basin for maybe $100. So you're going to get checks starting to roll in, and you need to keep track of where all those funding sources are coming from, which basins they're in, so that you can account for that. The story of MDV, we were able to do a lot of good projects with the MDV money. The timing of it came really well with the implementation of the watershed strategies we were trying to do. We did a number of waterway projects. We did some stream bank stabilizations. We did some manure storage abandonments, all within the small Pipe Creek watershed, which is really only about 5,000 to 6,000 acres in size. So we were able to really start utilizing the funding right away. It probably wasn't, we didn't really get rolling with it until probably 2020, even though it came in 2019. But we were able to really have projects in place to essentially get that funding on the ground. Initially, I was trying to use some of that for the demo farms that we have here in the county too. And we're able to use that initially. We don't use it for that anymore, but that was another great outlet to try and upstart our demo farm network. In 2020, so we went in 2019, we had 115,000 and change for MDV. In 2020, it went down to 28,000. And then in 2021, it went down to 12,000. 2022, the estimate was for $2,000. So you can see that the wastewater treatment plant was doing a really good job of optimizing phosphorus reductions on their own within their plant, which meant that that leads to a reduction in your MDV funding. So it was not nearly the amount of funding that I was expecting to get over a 5-year period. So initially I was trying to strategize and build at least a 5-year plan for how that funding was going to work. But the reality of it is it dropped off significantly, like before, essentially just kind of dropped out of the funding with respect to the wastewater treatment plant. Kudos to them for optimizing and reducing phosphorus on their end. But what that means is that you're just looking at a huge increase or decrease in overall funding coming in from MDV. So we talked a little bit about volatility. That's kind of where I'm at. So that's kind of the overall brief 5 years that it's been since we've kind of been talking about MDV funding from beginning to end. There was a lot of conversations on the front end of it as far as the funding. We've been able to have good conversations with the wastewater treatment plant. They certainly know more about the Fond du Lac County Land and Water Conservation Department and what we do. And hopefully that partnership will lead to other things maybe in the future. But I feel really good about the projects that we were able to do implementing MDV. But it certainly for me, it just, while it's a great funding source, it just was not the 5-year long kind of funding source that I was kind of planning on. And that's just kind of how it was a new program. And that's just really kind of how it all worked out for me. Lessons I've learned with MDV: don't spend the money before you get it. Those estimates are just estimates. The checks will start rolling in and eventually you'll kind of know how much you have to work with. But when considering MDV funding, I really, for me, this is my guidance, is that have it fit your county's current strategies that you're working on if you can. If it doesn't fit within your priorities of your county, it can lead to stretching yourself pretty thin overall within your department. I've got opportunities to have multi-discharge or variance in other basins, but those may not be areas where we're spending a lot of effort in terms of watershed strategies. So to take that funding now doesn't really fit within the priority strategies that we have as a department. So if you take it in a watershed and you don't have a really good strategy, or you're not really working heavily in that watershed in your county, it can stress you out. I'm here to tell you that. Trying to come up with a game plan of where you're going to go, even with just a little bit of MDV money, there's a lot of front end work that needs to be done, planning, bits, all that needs to be done. So I recommend you talk to your, as Andrew and Matt said, talk to your DNR staff. We did, before we even got the money here, had conversations with DNR staff between Calumet, Winnebago, and myself, just talking about our strategies and what we plan to do with the money. They were very helpful in kind of getting us pointed in the right direction. So that got us off on the right foot right away. I tried to get the watershed plan that's needed in bits put together as soon as I got the money and get it approved, so that as soon as I got the money, I can spend it, because you're really not supposed to spend the money before you get your plans approved. So if you really want to spend it, even though it's in your hand, you got to work on the front end to get the plan approved. So those are strategies that I highly recommend, is talking to your DNR staff about what you plan to do with it, so that you're all on the same page as far as with that plan, so that you don't run into snags when you get into putting things into bits, and then they get a plan that they maybe don't expect, maybe doesn't fit. And then you've got some questions and things that you need to answer that way, and it could hang up your use of those funds. Like I said, it was the intention of it was to be used for NR 151 implementation. In my county, that strategy may work, but I think for me to use it more effectively, I was needing to put it into the 9KL implementation, which is really what we've done over the last couple of years. And again, the funding side of it is it's great while it lasts, but it can be a little bit volatile. Hopefully, like Matt said, it won't be that way as much moving forward. But as you can see, I was initially trying to plan on a larger amount of funding over a period of time, thinking it was still going to decline, but I had no idea it was going to, and I don't think anybody did. I don't think anybody knew that it was going to quite drop off quite like that, but that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Okay, thank you, Paul. But also Andrew and Matt on this. I know we have just a couple more time for questions or for answers. I see, Andrew, you've been doing some good work in the chat box already, answering some of the questions. So if people want to look in there and see questions and answers, but I want to go through just a couple, because one of the first questions, what is the eligible rate for cover crop cost sharing? I don't know if Andrew or Matt, you have that.
The rates and stuff, we don't have any clear authority to require certain rates or cost sharing rates for cover crops or other practices as part of the MDV. By statute, MDV funding and questions related to cost share rates falls into the purview or authority of Department of Agriculture, because this is not a DNR funding source, it's an other source of funding. And I can follow up in the chat with the specific statutory reference. There typically, with some MDV plans have been submitted by counties, the questions of cost share rates, cost share forms, agreements have come up. And we have discussed this repeatedly with Department of Agriculture staff, and they're fully aware that as new counties enroll in the MDV program and have questions, they're willing to field those questions about cost sharing rates and so forth.
Okay. And then another one is that $35 per pound phosphorus reduction. Does that include landowner staff costs, or just the cost that comes out of the MDV funding?
Yeah, so that's just out of the MDV funding. You know, landowner dollars are not included in that. So yeah, I think we said, yeah, The number would be higher if you looked at landowner contributions too.
Okay, all right. It looks like we're at 8:45. As you can see, you do have, if you're a CCA, you can get the CCA credit, the half a credit for, I do believe, soil and water right up on the screen to scan. That you can print and send in for your self-certification. I don't know if there's anything else, Christine.
No, thank you guys very much. Maybe Andrew, Matt, Paul could just take a couple minutes and respond to a few of those other questions. There's a couple more coming through just in the chat while we wrap up. And thank you so much for joining us. And everybody has your email addresses, I'm sure. Maybe you can throw those in the chat in case there's more questions that come in. And otherwise, I think we'll head to a break. And we will be back here pretty shortly and at 9 o'clock with hydrological restoration 101. So it'll be a kind of a primer for land conservation supervisors. So see you guys all back here at 9. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.